Hi everybody. Today we're going to learn about bank fraud. And when you're finished this PowerPoint, you will have 5 questions answered that are provided during the video. The most important thing is to understand what bank fraud is and how it is distinct from bank robbery. Also, I want you to understand how checks can be altered and what are some of the security features that they have in checks to prevent them from being altered. And finally, why is certain types of bank fraud difficult to detect or stop, and then how do they detect it? So have you ever actually had something stolen from you, from a friend, family member, or a stranger? And as you can tell, when that happens to you, you feel violated and you feel, um, personally, you feel upset by that. Banks are a business and they have lots of assets. So there are many people in this world who would rather spend their intelligence trying to find a way to scam a bank and steal money than earn it honestly. So let's take a look at bank fraud and what it is. So what is bank fraud? Here's a very good definition. Bank fraud is the use of deliberate misrepresentation in order to fraudulently obtain money or other assets that are held by a bank or similar institution. So how is bank fraud distinct from bank robbery or theft? Well, fraud is distinct from simple bank robbery or theft because the perpetrator usually commits the fraud in secret, hoping that it will not be noticed until he or she has had ample time to move on. It also requires some sort of technical expertise in addition to usually being done in secret, and in addition to also requiring technical expertise. It is often referred to as a white collar crime as opposed to a blue collar crime. White collar refers to a professional. Professionals, men would wear white collar shirts in the old days to work, and so therefore they have called this type of crime, which requires a lot of technical knowledge, a white collar crime. And in most areas of the world, all types of bank frauds are illegal. So what are some types of bank fraud? As you know, in most areas of the world, bank fraud is illegal. One of the more prominent types of fraud is known as identity theft. Have you heard of that before? It's where one person uses another person's private identifying information to obtain money, and that money is usually in the forms of loans or credit. Somewhat related to identity theft is identity fraud. And how is that different? Well, it's where credit is obtained by the use of an entirely fictitious identity, where someone comes into a bank and applies for a loan or a credit card and gets it, and they have presented themselves or presented documents uh, that are entirely false. Instead of being, the name John Smith, for example, their name actually could be Henry, um, what's a good last name? Henry Fresh. And so they've committed identity fraud. They are completely not real. And while identity theft and similar crimes receive a great deal of publicity, they are far from the only crimes involving bank fraud. Fraud also involves checks as well, checking fraud, and is quite common. Forging checks or signatures on them, as well as altering checks that had already been written, are two ways in which check fraud is committed. In the case of the latter, it may be as simple as adding a few strokes of a pen to turn a check for $100 into one of $1,000. Another common type of fraud is check kiting. Now, this is a type of fraud that takes advantage of the fact that funds can be drawn on a deposited check before the money is actually removed from the check writer's account. Fraud also involves checks as well, checking fraud, and is quite common. Forging checks or signatures on them, as well as altering checks that had already been written, are two ways in which check fraud is committed. In the case of the latter, it may be as simple as adding a few strokes of a pen to turn a check for $100 into one of $1,000. Another common type of fraud is check kiting. Now, this is the type of fraud that takes advantage of the fact that funds can be drawn on a deposited check before the money is actually removed from the check writer's account. Well, check fraud has a history as long as checks themselves. When checks were first invented, sure enough, people came along right away trying to scam and perpetrate fraud. So, over the years, security features have been incorporated into many types of checks, especially payroll checks. These are checks coming from your employer. If you go get a job at Dunkin' Donuts and they pay you by check, take a look at that check. There's going to be some things built into the check to prevent fraud. Here are three important ways that they prevent fraud and have security features built into them. One thing is they have a unique watermark. A watermark is a mark that is embedded in the paper itself. It's hard to duplicate. They also use heat-sensitive ink, and in addition, these checks use extremely fine printed lettering that is not easily noticed or counterfeited. And so those are ways that they can incorporate security features into your check. Technology has placed many barriers in the way of those who would perpetrate bank fraud, but not all fraud can be completely prevented. One type of bank fraud that's difficult to detect or stop in time is that which is committed by bank employees themselves. This type of fraud committed by employees is usually, well, discovered by careful auditing of the bank's accounting records. Auditing is when you hire somebody or a third person will look over the records line by line, look at your balances, look at your transactions, and so they will hire someone to audit a bank's accounting records months down the road, which may be too late to discover or recover these funds. Many states require banks to present an audit of their accounting. So it's not uncommon for there to be fraud discovered, but unfortunately it's many months after it's been done.